Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros en el diario para celebrar nuestro 10º aniversario. Tenemos la suerte de tener a alguien tan importante y tan especial para nuestro mundo como ha sido la doctora Jane Goodall, que ha accedido a celebrar este cumpleaños tan especial with us. Thank you again, Jane, for Dr. Goodall for being with us. And we were talking about this really revolutionary moment that you went to Kenya and Tanzania to study animals in the wild, and you were mentioning actually your mother. You brought your mother with you. What was her role then?
Well, when Dr. Leakey tried to get permission for me to go and study chimpanzees in Tanzania, first, he had to find the money, and he managed that for 6 months. Secondly, Tanzania was Tanganyika back then, part of the crumbling British Empire. And the authorities said, no, we won't take responsibility for this young girl. She hasn't even been to college. And it's unheard of for a woman to go into a possibly dangerous forest where there are buffaloes and leopards. But in the end, they said, oh, all right, but she can't come alone. So it was my mother who volunteered to come for 4 of my 6 months. And she was a huge help because for 4 months, the chimpanzees ran away when they saw me. And she also, boosted my confidence, saying, Jane, you're finding out more than you think you are looking through your binoculars. And she started a little clinic, and fishermen came from far down the beaches, and she managed to make some amazing cures, although she wasn't a doctor or a nurse. And so she really helped me in those early days. Well, it was my dream when I was 10 years old. I told everybody I would go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them, and everybody laughed at me. Luckily, my mother said if I really wanted to do something like that, I'd have to work really hard, take advantage of every opportunity, and never give up. And so I finally saved up money to go out, first of all, to Kenya to visit a school friend who'd invited me. And that's when I met Louis Leakey, and he was the one who suggested I might try and study chimpanzees. I hadn't even been to college, but I was lucky. He chose me because I hadn't been to college, because my mind was all cluttered up with a very reductionist thinking of people studying animal behavior at the time. And because he felt that women might be more patient in the field. So I was really lucky in that way. And also the Africans were just becoming independent from Britain. And so, as you can imagine, there was a bit of resentment of the white males, but a young girl, well, that was different. They all wanted to help me. So I didn't really encounter difficulties at the beginning at all.
And I wonder also why chimpanzees? Why in all the animals that you could study?
Louis Leakey wanted somebody to study our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, because he felt that we shared a common ancestor 6 million years ago. And as he was interested in digging up the fossil remains of early humans, but behavior doesn't fossilize, he thought, well, if Jane sees behavior similar in chimps and humans, possibly we brought that with us from that common ancestor. And that gave him a feeling for how the bones he dug up might have behaved when they were clothed in living flesh.
And you have over there a portrait of one of your chimpanzees, and I also know that you call them with name and surname. In a way, you humanize them. Why did you do that?
Well, I don't think it's humanizing an animal to give it a name. I mean, if you have a dog or a cat, don't you give it a name? That doesn't make it human. I always named all my animals that I had as a child, and nobody had told me that scientists decided they should have numbers, which is absolutely ridiculous. That is David Greybeard, the first chimpanzee, who lost his fear of me. And on the other side is my wonderful mother.
Yeah, well, and since then, and obviously you have done so much, but I wonder how your approach to conservation has changed.
I don't think my approach to conservation has changed, but what happened was that when I realized chimpanzee numbers were decreasing and forests were being destroyed, I traveled around Africa to find out more about what I might be able to do to help the chimps. But I also discovered the plight of so many African people living in and around chimp habitat, you know, the crippling poverty, lack of health and education facilities. And I realized that when I flew over Gombe, which had been part of the Great Equatorial Forest Belt in 1960, by the late 80s, it was just a little island of trees surrounded by bare hills. And the people were cutting down the trees in their desperation to grow more food for their growing families or to make some money from charcoal or timber. And so I realized that if we didn't help the people to find ways of making a living without destroying their forest and their environment, that we couldn't save chimpanzees or anything else. And so we began our Jane Goodall Institute program, Tukari, working with the people to improve their lives.
We've seen also in other places that sometimes the conservation effort has collided in some ways with the interests or the worries of the local communities. So how's your approach to that? And do you think, are we doing okay in balancing both?
Well, it depends. In some cases, not at all. I mean, especially when big business gets involved and it moves in and starts taking natural resources and leaving the local people with more or less nothing. But our approach, working with the people, consulting with the people, giving them the tools to take care of their forests, they understand now that saving the forest isn't just for wildlife, it's also for their own future, that they need the forest to provide shade, regulate the rainfall and the temperature, and so on.
Was there a point where you thought that you crossed the line between being a researcher and an activist? Can you do both? How would you describe yourself?
It was in 1986 at a big conference. By that time, there were about 6 sites across Africa where chimps were being studied. And so at that conference, we had one session on conservation. And it was absolutely shocking seeing that the forests were going and chimp numbers were decreasing. And I went to that conference as a scientist. By then I had my PhD, but I left as an activist. It wasn't a decision I made. It just was a change within me.
And what do you think should be our priority now in conservation? What's your main areas of concern?
Well, obviously, climate change is a very existential threat, but so too loss of biodiversity. And we have to realize that we are part of the natural environment, and actually we depend on it. Even in the middle of an inner city, every breath we take of air, every sip of water, every mouthful of food comes from the natural world. But what we depend on is healthy ecosystems. And an ecosystem is a complex, it's a complex interrelatedness of the plants and animals in that ecosystem. And as they gradually become extinct, the ecosystem will collapse. And that's why the loss of biodiversity is a really, really existential threat.
Do you think that the pandemic helped highlight this thinking, this way of thinking? Did we learn anything maybe?
Well, the pandemic, just like climate change and loss of biodiversity, we brought the pandemic on ourselves, this time by the very disrespectful way that we treat animals, crowding into their environment, pushing them into closer contact with people, capturing them, trafficking them around the world, selling them in wildlife markets, and also our factory farms where billions of animals are trapped in horrific conditions to give people cheap meat. And so in all these cases, we provide conditions which make it relatively easy for something like a virus, which led to this pandemic, jumping from an animal to a person. And if it bonds with a cell in that person, it may lead to a new disease, a zoonotic disease it's called, such as this pandemic.
But in a way, in these 2 years, we had so much time of self-reflection in a way, and some of these debates were highlighted. Do you see any change after these years in any way in the way we live, or maybe the way policymakers approach some of these issues?
Well, people say time for reflection. I have been busier and more exhausted during the whole pandemic than ever before in my life, doing interviews like this, Zoom, Skype, every single day. For 2.5 years, I didn't have one day off. I didn't have one holiday. But some people have had time to reflect. I'd like to think that this was leading to change in behavior, but actually I rely on young people because it's their future and they're becoming concerned and more ready to change their ways than older people.
And of course, your latest book is called The Book of Hope, and you even have a podcast called Hopecast. So what are you hopeful about?
A lot of people don't see how I can have help, seeing how we're destroying the natural world and the cruelty that's going on. But I've got 4 main reasons for hope. First of all, it is the young people. The Jane Goodall Institute has a program for youth called Roots and Shoots, very strong in Spain, growing stronger all the time, because we have a Jane Goodall Institute in Spain. And these young people, when young people know the problems and they are enabled to take action, if they're allowed to choose what they want to do to make the world a better place. So in Roots and Shoots, we have members from kindergarten, university, everything in between, and every group chooses 3 projects, 1 to make the world better for people, 1 to make it better for animals, 1 to make it better for the environment. They roll up their sleeves and they take action. Hope is all about action. And my second reason for hope, this extraordinary intellect we haven't always used it wisely, but scientists are beginning to come up with innovative technologies to help us live in greater harmony with the natural world. And people are beginning to think about their own environmental footprint and to make wise choices in what they buy. Where did it come from? Did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals? Is it cheap because of unfair wages? And it's this consumer pressure that's changing the way business works. So then the next reason for hope is the resilience of nature. I talked about Gombe back in the late 1980s being surrounded by completely bare hills, just this little island of forest. But since we've been working with the local communities, there are no bare hills anymore. The forest has come back. So if you give a place that we've almost totally destroyed time and perhaps some help, then nature will take over again and animals and plants will come back. And then my final reason for hope is the indomitable spirit, the people who tackle what seems impossible and won't give up and very often succeed. And there are people who are sort of icons like Nelson Mandela, but there's also people living lives all around us, overcoming terrible social or physical disabilities, and are shining inspirations to everyone.
But in Europe, we have seen, maybe also it's a cultural thing, we're quite pessimistic. There are some very negative messages also on climate change. Do you think that's, in a way, an obstacle for action, being so dark about the future?
Well, I think the people who are climate change deniers don't really deny it. They just don't want to admit it because it might damage their profit. You know, at the moment, there's this crazy idea that short-term profit is more important than protecting the environment for the future. So they don't want to admit to climate change. And the only way to get through to them is to reach the heart, not to argue with them, not to point fingers at them, but to try and find a story or stories that will reach into the heart. And I'll give you one example. I met the CEO of a big corporation, international corporation, and he said, Jane, for the last 8 years, I have been really trying to make my corporation ethical, from the fair wages for the country where we get our supplies, helping their local community along the supply chain, to have environmentally ethical practices in our offices, and to treat our customers right. And he said there were 3 reasons. One, I saw the writing on the wall that we're using up natural resources in some places faster than nature can replenish them. That'd be the end of my business. Secondly, consumer pressure. People want to buy products that are being made ethically, and that's forcing us to change. But he said the real reason was my little girl came home from school. She was 8 years old, and she said, Daddy, they're telling me that what you're doing is harming the planet. That's not true, is it, Daddy? Because it's my planet.
So did that company change? Are they changing?
Absolutely. They have changed. They're very ethical. They're more or less off the grid. They've got everywhere's power from the sun, solar power.
And often it's companies, but also governments who have tough choices. And we're seeing now with the war in Ukraine, there's an emergency in a way, and people are suffering now. So how do you think policymakers, governments could deal with the emergency now, but also considering what we are bringing to ourselves, maybe for the inaction on climate change?
Well, you know, the thing is, I grew up in World War II. I was used to taking nothing for granted. We had rationing. We couldn't just go out into a shop and buy what we wanted. We didn't have food on demand from all over the world just like that. We could have one tiny piece of meat once a week. I think it was 1 egg per person per week, things like that. So many people today have unsustainable lifestyles. They have way, way, way more than what they need. And so if things get a little more expensive, maybe we value them more and we waste less, because the waste is terrible. And if the price of fuel goes up and up, maybe we think more about taking public transport or riding a bicycle or walking, which is what it used to be like.
So do you think an individual can really make a difference beyond policy, beyond governments, beyond companies?
Well, every individual matters. Every individual has a role to play. People get depressed, they get helpless and hopeless because they feel, what can I as an individual do? And they come to me and say, what can I do? And I say, okay, is there anything that concerns you particularly in the area where you live? Maybe it's trash in the street, maybe it's homelessness, maybe it's the treatment of stray dogs, whatever it is. See what you can do about that. See if you can get some friends to help you. And then you'll find, yes, I'm making a difference. And that'll make you feel good. So you'll want to do more and you'll inspire others. And then you realize that it's not just me picking up litter. All over the world, there are people picking up litter. So collectively, our actions in these different spheres make for big change.
What do you do in your daily life beyond your big projects, obviously, to make a difference in your local community?
Well, I'm hardly in my local community. I'm all over the world. I'm a global citizen. And what I do every day is to try and inspire people and give them hope. Because if we lose hope, then we become apathetic and we do nothing. And if we do nothing, we're doomed. We are ourselves in danger of creating a world that will lead not just to the extinction of even more animals and more plants, but to ourselves. And so that's why it's so important. My job is to give people hope globally. You know, we've got our Roots and Shoots program in 65 countries. We've got 23 Jane Goodall institutes, and that is a lot of work. I don't have time for much else.
And well, we see that Greta Thunberg had like this big impact for many young people and not so young around the world. But her message is quite strong, and sometimes it's a message of anger versus maybe your message of hope. So how do you see that? It's okay to be angry sometimes, or how do you see her?
I think anger is fine, but we need to channel anger into changing the world. I think we need people like Greta, but it's not my way. My way is because I think people need to change from within, and being angry and accusing them doesn't necessarily change you within. So, like the story of that little girl saying, "Daddy, it's my planet." That's the way to reach the heart. And so that's the way I do it. But we're in such a dire situation that I think we need both, probably. And there's no doubt that Greta has raised awareness. But, you know, our Roots and Shoots began in 91. So we've already got people who've grown up and they've taken their values of respect for each other, respect for animals, respect for the environment, into decision-making positions. And that's making a difference. We've got hundreds and thousands of members all over the world now, all working to make the world a better place, leading by example.
And do you see anything of yourself that you could recognize on Greta or people like her?
Well, that's never been my way. I understand it perfectly well.
And also, I wanted to ask you for advice for us, the media. I mean, we obviously have been covering the climate change, climate emergency for a long time. I think it's a big beat for every newspaper in the world, for many newspapers in the world. But sometimes we struggle to find readers, to maybe find the tone, to communicate what really matters. So I wonder, what's your advice for us to tell this big story in better ways?
Well, my advice would be, yes, we need to know the doom and the gloom. I mean, we need to know what's going on. But as I used to travel around the world 300 days a year. I've met so many people and so many projects that are immensely hopeful. Places like Gombe, where the forest has come back, animals rescued from the brink of extinction, disabled people doing magical things. We need the media to spend more time telling the positive stories, because those are the ones that give people hope. And they say, gosh, they restored that area. We can restore this area here. or they rescued that animal that was almost extinct. We have an animal almost extinct. We can try and rescue it too.
And well, as you say, you are traveling again after these years of Zoom Jane and so many chats like this. So what are you more focused on now? What's your next big project?
Well, I haven't got any kind of new project. You know, I just go on doing what I do. I will be traveling again, but not as much as before, simply because I've reached so many, and I'm saying millions, I mean literally millions of people just from sitting where I am now and talking to people around the world. So I think on social media, we talk about people having followings, right? The number of people following you on social media. Before the pandemic, I had almost 1 million. And now the people working it out worldwide, it's almost 1 billion.
Wow, that's a big audience.
I can't believe it, but that's what I'm told.
That's a huge responsibility too.
You're telling me? That's why I don't sleep at night. There's so much to do.
And just as a final thought, what did you learn in all these conversations that you have over the past 2 years with interviews and so many talks and the podcasts that you've done?
I learned that for whatever reason, I seem to have become some kind of icon, and people listen to what I say. Therefore, I have to work even harder to reach even more people. And to give you one example, one small example that was huge, that book of hope. A woman tried to commit suicide twice. She was 22, and her doctor in the hospital had her on suicide watch. You know, somebody watches you all night. But her doctor felt really sorry for her. She went to the bookshop so the young woman would have something to read. She saw the book of hope and she thought, yes. She took it in to the patient, and the watcher said from the beginning of the night, she started to read all the way through that book. Then she was quiet for a bit, and then she picked it up and read it all over again. And in the morning, they examined her and they discharged her. They said her attitude to life had changed 100%.
Wow. Well, just as a final thought, what can you say to the people who are watching us now to be hopeful about? You're all about hope, to just endure whatever the future brings with all the emergencies that we're living in.
Well, the main message is that every day you live, you make some impact on the world, depending on who you are, and make positive choices in the kind of impact you make. And as I say, I lived through World War II, and for several years it seemed that Britain was bound to be overrun by the Nazis, because the rest of Europe had all either been defeated or they'd capitulated. Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany, was unprepared for war, but we had Churchill. And Churchill roused a fighting spirit in the British to say, we will not be defeated. And that famous speech of his where he says, we will fight them on the shores and in the lanes and in the forests and in the cities. And that speech has been quoted by President Zelensky of the Ukraine. They have the same fighting spirit as Britain had. And Britain endured tremendous suffering in the war, but that spirit kept Britain going. And so, people just have to have hope and remember that hope is about action, not just sitting.
a fighting spirit. Well, thank you so much for your time, and really good luck with all your talks, and we be watching your messages and what you do. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Nice talking to you.
Take care.
Bye.